You remember exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the way they looked at you across a room. Maybe it was something they said. Something small. Something that shouldn't have landed as hard as it did. Maybe it was just the way they existed, the particular quality of their presence, and something in you went completely quiet and completely certain at the same time. You thought, this one is different, and you were not wrong. It was different. The feeling was unlike anything you had felt before, or at least unlike anything you could remember feeling that clearly. There was a recognition to it that went beyond attraction. It didn't feel like meeting someone new. It felt like remembering someone you already knew, like something in you had been waiting, without telling you, and had finally stopped waiting. That feeling was real. I am not going to tell you it wasn't, but I am going to tell you something about where it actually came from. And it is going to be uncomfortable. Not because I want it to be, but because the truth about why you fell in love, the real truth, underneath the story you've been telling yourself, is one of the most confronting ideas in the whole of psychology. And also, once you actually sit with it rather than flinch away from it, one of the most freeing. I'm David. Let's begin. Think about the person you loved most intensely. Not necessarily the longest, not necessarily the healthiest, the one you felt most completely, the one whose loss still has a particular weight to it, even now, the one you find yourself thinking about in quiet moments, in a way that still surprises you. What was it about them? Not the surface things, not the qualities that made them broadly appealing, the specific things, the ones that felt like they had been designed for you, the way they moved through a room, the quality of their attention when it turned toward you, the particular thing they did or said that made you feel for the first time in a long time, genuinely seen, the thing that made you think, finally, this person gets it, this person gets me. Hold that feeling for a moment, because that feeling, that specific overwhelming sense of being known, is exactly what we need to talk about. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist who spent his entire professional life trying to understand why people do things that confuse even themselves, why intelligent people make choices that destroy them, why someone can love another person with absolute certainty and yet barely know them, why the relationships that feel most like destiny so often end in the kind of pain that takes years to recover from. His answer was not comfortable, but it was precise. And it goes something like this. The person you fell in love with was real, but a significant part of what you fell in love with was not them. It was a figure you had been building inside yourself, quietly, without knowing it, long before you ever met them. And when they walked in and matched that inner figure closely enough, your unconscious mind lit up like a recognition, like, there you are. I've been waiting for you. Jung called this projection, and understanding it will change the way you see every relationship you've ever had. Here is what projection actually means, not in the pop psychology sense, but in the real sense. Every one of us carries parts of ourselves that we have hidden, not always deliberately, but hidden because at some point those parts didn't fit. They were too much, not enough, wrong for the environment we grew up in. The qualities we were told weren't acceptable, the desires we learned to suppress, the version of ourselves we put in a box and pushed into the dark because it wasn't safe or wasn't welcome, or simply didn't match who we decided we needed to be. Jung called this the shadow, and the shadow doesn't disappear just because you stop looking at it. It sits in the dark and it waits, and what it waits for is a chance to be seen. Here is where it gets personal, because the shadow's favorite trick, its most reliable, most powerful mechanism, is to find what it's carrying in someone else, to look at another person and see, In them, the very qualities it has been unable to claim in you, and then to reach toward those qualities with everything it has. That reaching is what you felt as attraction. Think about that for a second. The things that drew you most powerfully to the person you're thinking of right now, the qualities that felt electric, that felt like recognition, that felt like finally. Those qualities are almost certainly a map of something in you that hasn't been allowed to exist. The fearlessness you saw in them, when you have spent years constrained by anxiety. The emotional openness that moved you, when you have spent years learning not to need. The confidence, the warmth, the groundedness, the particular way they seemed to know who they were, all of it reflecting back at you something you were longing for. Not in them, in yourself. You weren't just attracted to them, you were attracted to a version of yourself that you hadn't yet become. And your unconscious mind, which is considerably smarter than your conscious mind in certain ways, and considerably less honest in others, took that longing and placed it entirely onto them, made it about them, made it feel like they were the answer, like they were the source. That is projection. And it is not a flaw in how you work. It is how every human being works. The most psychologically sophisticated person you know has done this. Your parents did this. Everyone who has ever fallen in love has done this, in some measure, at some point. The projection is not the problem. The problem comes later. Because here is what always happens. In the beginning, they match the image closely enough that the feeling is overwhelming. Everything they do seems to confirm what you projected onto them. They are exactly who you needed them to be. The connection feels effortless, not because it is effortless, but because the image fits and the friction hasn't started yet. And then, slowly or suddenly, depending on the relationship, they stop matching the image. They do something that the person you fell in love with would never have done. They show you a part of themselves that doesn't fit the picture. They have a bad day or a bad year. They are tired or scared or smaller than the version you needed them to be. They are, in other words, a real person, with the full complexity and contradiction and occasional disappointment that being a real person involves. And something shifts. For some people, the shift is gradual, a slow cooling, a growing sense of distance, a feeling that the thing that was once so electric has become ordinary in a way that feels like loss. For others, it's faster, a specific moment, a specific disappointment, where the image cracks and the real person is visible beneath it, and the gap between the two feels unbridgeable. Either way, the relationship reaches a fork in the road. One direction is the most common one. The projection has worn thin, the intensity has faded, and rather than understanding what's happening, rather than turning the lens back on themselves, both people conclude that the love has gone, that they were wrong about the connection, that this person turned out not to be who they thought. They separate, or they stay together, but in a version of the relationship that has lost something neither of them can name. And then, when enough time has passed, they find someone new, someone who matches the image, and the whole thing begins again. This is the pattern. You know this pattern. You may have lived this pattern. The same type of person, different face. The same extraordinary beginning. The same slow erosion or sudden crack. The same confusion about how something that felt so certain could end up so far from where it started. Jung would say, the pattern is not a coincidence. The pattern is the projection, looking for somewhere to land, finding the same shape again and again, because the inner image hasn't changed. And the inner image won't change until you stop placing it onto people outside you and start looking at what it's actually telling you about yourself. The other direction at that fork in the road is harder, much harder, but it's the one worth talking about. It requires something that most people find almost impossible: turning the attention back on yourself at exactly the moment when everything in you wants to focus on them, when you want to blame them for the disappointment, or grieve the version of them that's gone, or simply find someone else who matches the image better. Instead, you ask, what was I projecting? What were the qualities I saw in them that I was actually longing for in myself? What was my shadow carrying that I was asking them to carry for me? That question is not comfortable, but it is the most important question a relationship can prompt you to ask. Because the answer is not about them. The answer is a direct map to the parts of yourself that are waiting. None of this is quick. None of it is clean. And none of it means you should stop falling in love or approach relationships with a kind of detached clinical caution that drains them of everything that makes them worth having. Jung never said stop projecting. He said become conscious of what you're projecting. There is an enormous difference between those two things. Become conscious enough to notice when the overwhelming feeling of recognition is the signal. This matters. Pay attention to this, rather than the destination. Conscious enough to stay curious about who the other person actually is, rather than needing them to confirm the image you've already placed on them. Conscious enough, when the projection wears thin, to turn inward rather than immediately outward. To ask what this is showing you, rather than just grieving what you've lost. That consciousness doesn't make love less. It makes love more honest, more capable of surviving contact with reality, more capable of becoming the kind of thing that actually lasts. And here is something that often surprises people when they first really sit with these ideas. Understanding the projection doesn't make the feeling go away. You don't suddenly become coldly rational about love. You don't stop being drawn to people. You don't lose the capacity for that sense of recognition. What changes is what you do with it. Instead of handing yourself over to the feeling completely, instead of concluding this is destiny and following it off a cliff, you hold two things at the same time. The feeling is real and it is pointing somewhere. And I want to know where it's pointing. Not just toward them, toward me. That dual awareness, the full weight of the feeling alongside the curiosity about what the feeling is showing you, is what psychological maturity in love actually looks like. It is not detachment. It is presence combined with honesty, feeling it fully while staying awake inside it. Most people have experienced this at least once, even if they couldn't name it. A relationship in which the intensity was real, but something else was also real. A kind of clarity alongside the feeling. A sense of being genuinely in it while also being genuinely aware. Those are often the relationships people describe years later as the ones that changed them most. Not always the ones that lasted, but the ones that mattered in a way that went beyond the duration. There is something else worth saying about the quality of that feeling, the homecoming, the recognition, because I don't want to dismiss it entirely. Because it does contain something true. When you meet someone and feel that overwhelming sense of being known, even before they could possibly know you, there is a real psychological event happening. Not just your shadow reaching toward its own unlived qualities in another person. Something else as well. Jung believed that the most powerful attractions also contain a genuine perception of the other person. The unconscious can read people in ways the conscious mind cannot. It picks up information too quickly and too subtly for ordinary attention to catch. It senses depth. It senses complexity. It senses something real. So the recognition is not entirely your own inner life projected outward. Part of it is a genuine perception of something real in them. The problem is that in the early stages of intense attraction, you cannot separate the two. You cannot tell what is them and what is you. The projection and the perception are completely tangled together. indistinguishable from the inside. Over time, as the projection gradually thins, as the intensity settles into something more ordinary, as you begin to actually know the person rather than the image, you start to be able to see the difference. What was them? What was you? What was real? And what was what you needed to see? That process of separation, of being able to distinguish the person from the image, is one of the most valuable things a relationship can offer. It is slow. It requires a willingness to keep looking honestly at something that can be uncomfortable to look at. But what remains when you can finally see the other person clearly, without the image, without the projection, without the distorting light of what you needed them to be, is something that projection can never give you. It is the specific satisfaction of knowing someone real, of being known by someone who sees you as you actually are, of choosing each other not because of what you represent to each other's inner worlds, but because of who you actually are. Complicated, imperfect, specific, real. That is what the projection was always trying to lead you toward. Not itself, not the feeling. The thing on the other side of the feeling. You have a type. Almost everyone does. And the type is not random. Maybe it's people who need saving, who carry a wound you recognize, who need someone steady, and you are steady, and so you fit together like a key in a lock. Maybe it's people who are emotionally unavailable, who give you just enough warmth to keep you invested, but never enough to make you feel completely secure. Maybe it's people who are extraordinarily confident, or extraordinarily free, or extraordinarily alive in a way that you are not. Whatever the type is, and you know what yours is, even if you've never said it out loud, it is not bad luck. It is not that you keep attracting the wrong people. It is that your unconscious keeps recognizing the same shape, the same quality the shadow has been carrying and hasn't been able to claim. The same image, looking for a home. The type is the projection wearing a different face each time. Here is what that looks like in practice. You end a relationship. You are clear-eyed about what went wrong. You understand, at least consciously, the dynamic that kept you trapped. You give yourself time. You work through it. You feel, eventually, ready. And then you meet someone new. And they are different from the last person. Genuinely different, different personality, different background, different habits. But within a few weeks, a few months, you feel something familiar. Not the person, the feeling, the same quality of intensity, the same sense of being just slightly out of reach of something you need, the same cycle beginning to turn. Because different face, same projection. The only thing that interrupts the cycle is not time, and not better choices, and not a stronger resolution going in. It is understanding. It is the willingness to look at what the projection is carrying, and ask yourself, honestly, without flinching, what this is telling you about the work you still have to do inside yourself. That is not a comfortable question, but it is the question that actually changes things. And this is why telling yourself, after a relationship ends, that you just need to choose differently next time doesn't work. You resolve to go for someone different, someone stable, someone who is actually available, someone who doesn't have the thing the last one had that caused all the pain. And for a while you hold that resolution, and then someone walks in who has the feeling, that recognition, that sense of home, and the resolution dissolves before you even notice it dissolving. Because the resolution was conscious, and the projection is not. You cannot outthink a projection. You can only understand it, and that understanding is available to you. It doesn't require years of therapy, though therapy helps. It doesn't require becoming a student of Jung, though if you're curious, there is a life's worth of material there. It requires something simpler and harder than either of those things. It requires honesty about your own patterns, the willingness to look at what keeps recurring in your relationships, not as bad luck or poor choices, but as information, as data about your own inner life. The pattern is not your enemy. The pattern is the most honest thing about you. It is the part of you that hasn't been able to lie, that keeps showing up, keeps reaching, keeps finding the same shape, because it is still trying to complete something that hasn't been completed yet. When you can look at the pattern with that kind of eyes, not with shame or frustration, but with genuine curiosity, you have already begun to change it. And understanding it requires asking the question that most people never ask. Not, why do I keep choosing this type of person? But, what is this type of person showing me about myself that I haven't been willing to look at directly? The emotionally unavailable person. What quality of theirs were you reaching toward before the unavailability became the defining thing? Because that quality is yours. Waiting. The person who needed saving. What part of you came alive in that dynamic that doesn't come alive elsewhere? That aliveness is pointing somewhere in you. The extraordinary confidence, the freedom, the ease. What would it mean for you to inhabit those qualities yourself, rather than finding them in someone else? That is the question the relationship was always trying to ask. Let's slow down here, because there is a particular experience that almost everyone has had, and almost no one has accurate language for. You lose someone. A relationship ends, through a breakup, through distance, through the natural death of something that was always going to be temporary. And the grief is larger than it should be, larger than the relationship seems to warrant, if you're being honest. You weren't even together that long, or you knew it wasn't right. You could see the problems clearly, you had doubts, and yet the loss feels catastrophic, like something structural has been removed, like a part of you that you didn't know was load-bearing has suddenly gone. Here is what's actually happening. When a relationship built heavily on projection ends, you don't only lose the person, you lose the place where parts of yourself were living, the qualities you were projecting onto them, the fearlessness, the depth, the groundedness, whatever it was. All of that has to come home. It has nowhere else to go. You are not only grieving them, you are grieving the parts of yourself that were living outside you, in them, that now have to be faced directly. You are grieving the return of your own inner life. This is why certain losses break people open in ways that seem impossible to explain from the outside. It is not that the love was greater than anyone realized. It is that the loss has triggered a reckoning that was always coming, a reckoning with the inner life that the relationship had been postponing. That reckoning is not a punishment. It is an invitation. Think about the person whose loss broke you open more than it should have, the one you couldn't explain to people around you, because on paper it didn't make sense. The relationship wasn't that long, or wasn't that serious, or you both knew it wasn't working, and yet you couldn't get up off the floor of it for months. What were you actually losing? Try to be specific, not them generally. What specific quality? What specific feeling? What specific version of yourself that existed in their presence? What was that? Because that thing, that specific thing, is the thing your unconscious was keeping alive outside yourself because it hadn't found a home inside you yet. And when the relationship ended, it came back, homeless, raw, needing somewhere to go. The grief was real, but what you were grieving was more complex than them. You were grieving the loss of a part of yourself that had briefly been allowed to exist, and now had to be reabsorbed into an inner life that didn't quite know what to do with it yet. That is the invitation in the loss. Not to find someone new who will hold those qualities for you again, to find those qualities in yourself, to stop needing them to exist in another person because you have found a way to let them exist in you. That is what changes the pattern, not resolution, not time, integration. Jung had a word for what the invitation is pointing toward. He called it individuation, the process of becoming more fully yourself, not by finding the right person, not by collecting better experiences, but by slowly bringing what has been unconscious into consciousness, by taking back the projections, by integrating what they were pointing toward. It is lifelong. It is imperfect. But every relationship that leaves you genuinely changed, not just wounded, but changed, has moved you further into it. Now here is the part I want to be careful about, because everything I've said could land as an argument that love is an illusion. It is not. Jung was not saying love is false. He was saying that love begins in projection. That projection is actually the door. It's the mechanism the psyche uses to identify what it needs. It sees something in another person that it needs to develop in itself, and it reaches toward it. The intensity of that reaching is the signal. It's the psyche saying, pay attention to this. This matters. The projection gets you there. It creates the conditions for something that might, if both people are willing, become genuinely real. The problem is not the projection. The problem is when neither person understands what's happening, so the projection is never examined. And both people spend years relating not to each other, but to the images they've placed on each other. Both genuinely warm, both genuinely invested, and yet somehow never quite meeting. You've probably felt this, that quality of a relationship that is close, but not close enough. Intimate, but somehow partial. Where you feel loved and simultaneously feel that the person loving you is seeing a version of you that is not quite the version you inhabit. That is what an unexamined projection feels like from the inside of a relationship. Both people present, both people caring, and yet the depth they're both reaching for keeps sitting just out of reach. The marriages that end after 20 years with one partner saying they never really knew the other. The relationships that feel simultaneously close and lonely. This is often what happened, even if neither person has a word for it. What becomes possible on the other side of the projection, when you begin to withdraw it, when you begin to see the other person as they actually are rather than as you need them to be. Jung called the reality of the other. It is quieter than the projection. It doesn't have that electric quality of the early days. It doesn't feel like destiny. It feels like something more demanding and more real. Two people actually trying to see each other, choosing each other not because of what they represent to each other's inner worlds, but because of who they actually are. That is rarer than it should be, but it is possible. And it begins, always, with the willingness to understand what the projection was about, and to do the work of taking it back. I said earlier that you cannot outthink a projection, but you can do something that is more useful than outthinking it. You can use it. Every time you feel that particular pull, that sense of recognition, that electric quality of finally, instead of simply following it, you can ask a question alongside it. What is this feeling pointing to in me? Not instead of going toward the person. Alongside it, as an addition to the experience, not a replacement for it. What is it about the way they move through uncertainty that moves me so completely? What is it about their particular freedom, or their depth, or their ease with emotion that I find so overwhelming? If I am this drawn to that quality in them, what does that tell me about where I am in relation to that quality myself? You don't have to answer the question immediately. You don't have to have the full psychological insight in the moment. The question alone begins something. It plants a seed of awareness that will grow quietly in the background, informing how you move through the relationship, informing how you respond when the image begins to crack, informing what you do with what you find on the other side. The relationships that genuinely change people, that leave them more themselves rather than less, that expand them rather than diminishing them, are almost always relationships in which this kind of questioning happened. Not always consciously, not always with the vocabulary of Jung or projection or the shadow, but with some instinct toward honesty, some willingness to be changed by what the relationship was showing, rather than defended against it. Those relationships don't always last in the conventional sense. Some of the most transformative relationships in a person's life are not the ones that became long-term partnerships. They are the ones that broke something open, that refused to let the person remain exactly as they arrived, that cost something and gave something back that could not have been predicted at the start. If you have had a relationship like that, and most people have, even if they primarily remember the pain of it, it was not a failure. It was the most efficient teacher you've encountered. And the lesson it was trying to teach had your name on it from the beginning. I want to leave you with something that I hope lands clearly. Every person you have ever been powerfully drawn to has been, in some sense, a messenger. Not always a kind one, not always a willing one, but a messenger, carrying something your inner life was trying to tell you, showing you, in the specific qualities that moved you most, a map of where you still have growing to do. The people who hurt you most, the ones who matched the image so completely and then turned out to be so different from it, they were not mistakes. They were the most urgent messages. The ones your unconscious sent because the quieter ones hadn't worked. You can spend the rest of your life being angry at the messengers, or you can read the message. The message is always the same. It says, here is what you are still becoming. Here is what you have been looking for in all the wrong places. Here is what has been waiting for you. Not in another person, but in yourself. Every quality you have ever been overwhelmed by in someone else. Every time you felt that particular recognition, that sense of finally, that feeling of home, that was not them calling to you. That was you calling to yourself. The darkest truth about why you fell in love is that it was never entirely about them. The most freeing truth is that it was always, underneath everything, about you finding your way back to yourself. You have been falling in love all this time with the person you were trying to become, and that person, the one you've been reaching toward through every powerful attachment, every overwhelming recognition, every loss that broke you open further than you expected, that person has been here the whole time. That is not a small thing to understand. It changes what love is for. Thanks for listening, and I hope you've gained something from our time together. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. This helps us to continue to keep making great content for you. Take care as always.